you for coming tonight. We are going to be looking at John chapter 11, at least the greater part of John chapter 11. I want to remind you the way chapter 10 ends, because that is crucial, I think, to our understanding of John chapter 11. In John chapter 10, we have Jesus in conflict again with the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. And they were so enraged by some of the things that he said that they took up stones to stone him. And then he asks, now which miracle am I being stoned for? Which I thought was a great line, but anyway. Then they tried to grab him, and he got away. And it says in verse 40 that Jesus went back. He's in Jerusalem. He went back across the Jordan. And he's now in the province that's known as Perea. And John helps us understand why this area at one time was quite famous, because that's where John the Baptist began his ministry. He would live out here in the desert, have a lunch of locust and wild honey. You can't beat that for lunch. And then he would come down to the Jordan River, and people would come there and meet him, and he would preach, and he would baptize in the Jordan River. This is where Jesus' ministry began. He was baptized in the Jordan River. The Spirit came down upon him in the form of a dove, and that's when it all started. So John 10, at the end of the chapter, says that Jesus went back to the original spot where he started his ministry, where John the Baptist had been baptizing. And the last thing we read in chapter 10 is that many people believed in him there. And I think John wants us to see the contrast. All he could get in Jerusalem was an argument. What he got over here with the people in Perea was belief. So it's quite a contrast. And unfortunately, we'd say, well, it shouldn't be like that. No, it shouldn't. But it was. So now we come to the beginning of chapter 11, and John introduces us to a man that he has not mentioned before. His name is Lazarus, and he got real sick. Don't know what with, but could have been the first COVID case. I don't know. But he was from Bethany. Now this big J, as a child of 4 can plainly see, is Jerusalem. And this little dot, which you may not be able to see except in the front row, is Bethany. It's about 2 miles, somewhere like that, from Jerusalem going east. You go up the crest of the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, start down the other side, and there's a little village called Bethany. And I don't know how many people lived there, but I know one of the families that lived there was Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And I just want to say something about the dynamic of that family. I've always imagined these 3 people living together in one house. I don't know why, but I always have. But there's really no reason to think that way. It may be that Mary and Martha were married. It's quite possible. Then why weren't their husbands mentioned? Well, you ladies know why. Because they're not worth anything, But Mary and Martha, they are enamored with Jesus, what he stands for, what he teaches. And they've got a brother who, to this point, has not even been mentioned. There's one famous story in Luke's gospel about Mary and Martha. Do you know that story? Yeah, where Martha is someone who cleans and cooks and worries, and Mary is someone who just stares at Jesus. My wife is a Martha with moments of Mary. I have a dear friend. I say dear friend, we don't have contact much anymore, but she is a Mary with... She had a Martha moment in 1982 and didn't like it, so she decided that, she may watch this video and know who I'm talking about, and that will be hilarious. But anyway, Martha wanted Jesus to instruct Mary to help her because this Getting ready for the meal was wearing her out. And Jesus speaks kindly to Martha, but says, Mary has really made a good choice. She's made a good choice in spending her time listening to what I have to say. And I think in doing that, Jesus is aware of the fact, even back then, that his time is limited. And meals are not that important to Jesus. He told his disciples once in John chapter 4, I have food to eat that you don't even know about. Because my food is to do the will of my Father. But Martha needs help with dinner and Mary ain't helping. So we always think of Martha as the domestic one and Mary as the, what is Mary? A scholar, someone who just lives to hear the teaching of Jesus. She's just that kind of a person. But probably that's a bit of an exaggeration for both of them. I would suggest to you that Martha has keen spiritual interest and that Mary probably helped every once in a while. Okay? So, like I said, that one story, that one episode makes us think about what Mary and Martha were like. But what was Lazarus like? We don't know.
He was sick.
There's two things, really, that we know about Lazarus. Number one, Jesus loved him. Interestingly, John tells us that Jesus loved him. Even though John is called the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so he's willing to admit, I wasn't the only one. Jesus loved Lazarus, and he loved Martha, and he loved Mary. If there was ever anything that you could compare to a home that Jesus had, it was here on the hillside at Bethany. Many people believe that it was often during Jesus' last week that when the evening came, he would go to Bethany and spend the night with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Anyway, he loved them deeply. They were very important to him. And then Lazarus gets really sick, to the point where the sisters said, we need Jesus. And so they have one of their friends, relatives, nephews, who knows what he is. Maybe one of their children. They could have been married for all we know. But they sent someone to find Jesus. And John doesn't say where Jesus was, except that chapter 10 closes with him being in this area. And if he hasn't wandered too far away, he's probably somewhere around a day's journey away. Okay? About a day's journey, probably, from here to Jerusalem. So they immediately send someone to find Jesus. And the text says that when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he didn't do anything. He just waited. Even though he has a special relationship with these three, and even though he's concerned about their well-being, I know that he decides to wait 2 full days. And in those days, he converses with his disciples about what's wrong with Lazarus. He tells them, first of all, that they don't have to worry about Lazarus. This illness is not going to end up in death. It's not going to end up in death. And then he says, after 2 full days, let's go to back in this direction, because Lazarus is asleep and I'm going to wake him up. A euphemism which the disciples went, which it nearly always did. What? Went right over their heads. So they said, well, if he's asleep, we would really prefer if he just woke his own self up. Because, Lord, we can't go here. It's too close to here. And surely you remember the last time you were here, that you came that close to death. Don't you remember that, Lord? Well, and then Jesus says in kind of strange, let me just read it because Maybe you can help me understand it. Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. Say what?
They have flashlights.
They have a candle, but a lantern. I think this is Jesus' unique way of saying, guys, I've got a limited amount of daylight in my life. You don't understand that the end is coming, and it's coming soon. He doesn't say that, but he knows it's coming soon. It is now probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 months, maybe less, because we don't know how long there is between the end of chapter 10 and the beginning of chapter 11. You will remember that at the end of chapter 10, it was the Feast of Dedication, which is in December, and it's going to be in late March or April, when Passover is going to come, and that will be the last feast for Jesus. So if there's a month that has gone by, it took Lazarus a while to get sick, then Jesus is looking at 2 or 3 months. He said, I've got a certain amount of daylight, and as long as I'm working in the daylight, it's going to be fine. But night's coming. And I think at the same time, he is talking about the fact that there are people who try to walk at night, and they are up to no good. And the no good will be clearly evidenced in chapter 12, well, the end of chapter 11, and then on into chapter 12. So he says, I've got 12 hours. And then it says, after he said this in verse 11, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going to wake him up. Well, he'll get better. No. Lazarus is dead. Now we can almost figure out, if we figure it's a day's journey to here, and he stayed 2 days, and then a day's journey back. And how long had Lazarus been dead when Jesus got there? Do you remember?
4 days.
4 days. Which means, in all likelihood, that soon after the messenger left from Bethany to find Jesus, Lazarus died. Indeed, he was very sick. The sisters could see that, and they sent somebody to find Jesus, and he hadn't been gone very long, and sure enough, Lazarus was dead. Now, Thomas, who unfortunately everybody thinks Thomas's first name was Doubting, but Thomas, who is called Didymus, that's the Hebrew, I think. One of them is Hebrew, one of them is Greek, I can't remember, but both of them mean the twin. And I've always wondered what Thomas's twin brother was doing while Thomas was walking all over the country behind Jesus, learning about the kingdom of God. His twin is never mentioned. He's only mentioned as a twin. We got any twins? Not one twin? People often think Paul and I are twins, but we're not.
I got a shirt that looks like that, but I'm glad I didn't wear it tonight.
Paul, I sent you the memo so we could be twins, and this would drive the point of the lesson home, but you didn't listen. Okay. So Thomas says, all right, if he's going, we might as well go. Why? So that we can die
with him.
With him. Doubting Thomas says, I'd rather be dead than live without Jesus. That's essentially what he's saying. I'd rather be dead than to live without Jesus. Let's just, somebody better turn off their phone. Paula, was that you? Was that your phone?
Sure.
Okay. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn it off. Anyway, let's go with him that we can die. Now, it takes them a day probably to get to Bethany, and when Jesus is on the outskirts of town, he has not yet arrived in town. The Shiva, I'm not Jewish, but it's a 7-day mourning period where people people really got after it in terms of mourning. We don't mourn the way Easterners mourned in the first century. There was a lot of wailing, and you take dust when you're serious, and you throw it in the air, and it gets in your hair, and then you put it in your... It is a serious time of lamenting and crying out loud. That's the kind of mourning that was going on in Bethany. And it was all in support of Mary and Martha, who may have done some of that kind of mourning themselves. I don't know. But other people would do that, and they would do it for 7 days. That's the way you showed respect for the dead. That's the way you showed support for the people who were sad. You joined them in this wailful mourning. Anyway, somebody got word to Martha that Jesus is almost here. And Martha's not going to wait. She charges out to meet Jesus. Now, you see, if you only think of Martha as someone who can cook and clean, you won't appreciate the fact that she left just like that because she wanted to be near Jesus. She wanted to talk with Jesus. She wanted to pour her heart out to Jesus about what was going on. And the first thing she says to him, of course, is, "Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died." There's not a direct rebuke in that. But you kind of get the hint. I have been told on occasion, if you had only been here... Oh, I don't remember who it was that said that.
Yeah.
If you had only been here, and that means you should have been here. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now you've got to remember, this comes from a woman who is heartbroken. This comes from a woman whose brother has been dead a day or so. And she is just in the absolute pits. And she is just grasping at straws. And now she says, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died. It's an if-only statement. Well, Jesus says that, Lazarus has a future. Your brother will rise again. And Martha says, yeah, I know he's going to rise at the last day. She has good theology. She believes in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus makes the statement that is fundamental to what we believe and what we live by. Verse 24:5, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Now, do you believe this? I know he'll rise at the last day. Martha, listen. I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And Martha doesn't directly answer the question. Well, she said, yes, Lord. And then here it comes. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. Did you see that? Who has come into the world. I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, who comes into the world. Now, I believe that Martha said those very words, but I believe they fit in well with what John has been getting at all along. Do you remember his purpose in chapter 20? Somebody tell me they remember what his purpose is in writing this book in chapter 20.
So that
Paul,
we
would
will
you like to
believe.
tell? Yes.
So that they may believe.
There were many other things that Jesus did in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that what? Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, what? You may have life in his name. And Martha comes to that point that John hopes we will all come to. That we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So, her theology about the resurrection at the last day is very, very solid. But Jesus wants her to focus not so much on the future, he wants her to focus on him. So after this, She went back and called her sister Mary aside. Picture this. Martha comes in and says, "A word, Mary?" Because there's mourners everywhere. But she doesn't want to spread the word. "Mary, come here. Jesus is here, and he's asking for you." Mary says, "I didn't want to do any more housework anyway." And she's off to see Jesus. And unfortunately, or fortunately, a number of the mourners who have been with Mary and comforting her, I don't know how they were doing that, but they were comforting her. They saw her get up quickly and leave, and what did they presume? That she was going to the tomb to mourn there. And they thought, well, we can't let her mourn alone. Let's go with her. And so they all follow her, and she passes by the tomb and goes to the outskirts of town, and there she finds Jesus, and she falls at his feet. And she is weeping. And again, the Greek word in that context is a word that suggests loud wailing. Mary's doing that. The people who came with her are doing that. It's quite a scene. It's something that we would be probably uncomfortable with. But that's what's happening at Jesus' feet. Then it says, and this is interesting, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. Does anybody else have another translation for that verse? One that would get closer to what it really means? This is verse 33. Yes, Debbie. What is Jesus doing in verse 33 in the Living Bible?
When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jewish leaders wailing with her, he was moved to indignation and deeply troubled.
Oh, good for the Living Bible. Usually I'm not real, up on the Living Bible, but it is a word that doesn't suggest sorrow. It is a word that suggests indignation or even anger. Anybody have anger in their translation? You got anger? Good for them. Because that's the word, that's what really the word means. I put something in my notes that I wanted to read. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but sometimes, by the way, some of you have asked me, what does CF mean? It means I don't know how to spell Confederate. No, I made that up. CF means compare. Compare, it's just a short form that I used when I wrote papers and stuff. But anyway, it means compare, and then I give you things to compare to. So I gave you Matthew 9:30, Mark 1:43, and Mark 14 and verse 5. When the word, first of all, was used with animals, it would be used of a horse when a horse snorted. Don't say that Don said that Jesus snorted, because no one will understand what you mean by that. But it actually is a pretty good picture of what Jesus did. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 30, after healing the blind man, it says that Jesus warned them sternly, see that no one knows about this. That's the word. He warned them sternly. Don't you tell. And then again in Mark chapter 1 and verse 45, Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. Same word. And finally, the woman came and wasted the perfume on Jesus. You remember in Mark chapter 14? It says in the response to what she had done, and they said the money could have been given to the poor, it says they rebuked her sharply. That's the word that's used. So while the women and the people who came with her are weeping, Jesus is, picture it. Don't picture it. Picture it. Does that seem to fit the situation? I think that Jesus is angry, he is disgusted, he is indignant because of what sin has done to the world and to the people who live in it. He doesn't want to see Mary wail. He doesn't want to see Martha like she's losing her mind. And all of these people who've come up and they're throwing dust in the air and everybody's upset. And Jesus, I believe, is angry because this is not the world that God intended. This is not the horrible sadness that he wanted his creation to experience when he first made it. And no one knows that better than Jesus. Jesus was there in the beginning. Jesus saw the forming of Adam and the forming of Eve. He was involved in their creation. He saw the garden. He saw how good it was. And then sin came along. And it's been downhill ever since. And Jesus, I believe, is angry and indignant because of what sin has done to the world. Now, don't get me wrong. That's not the only emotion that Jesus felt. The sadness can be seen in verse 35. You know the verse, the one you all want to memorize and say, I memorized a verse in the Bible today. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And that word is a word of sadness. That word is a word, I think, of identifying not with the sin that caused the problems, but with the heartache that Mary, especially on this occasion, felt. And so at that point, John just says, let me tell you how the people reacted when all of that was going on. Some of them pointed out how much Jesus loved Lazarus. It was obvious. It had affected him at his core that he was dead. See how much he loved Lazarus. But then others said, well, you know, it's really a shame. Somebody who could open the eyes of the blind surely could have helped Lazarus, you know, if he'd have been here, if he'd just been here. So people were talking differently about what Jesus might have done and so forth, but it shows a variety of mixed feelings. Once again, as Jesus approached Lazarus' grave, the text again said he was deeply moved. Maybe indignant again in your translation, Debbie, for all I know, but it's the same word. He was angry when he saw how sad people were, and then when he came to the tomb, picture it, all of these people are now following Jesus. He wants to know where Lazarus is, and so he approaches Lazarus' tomb. He's standing in front of it. I don't know how far back, but all the mourners are probably lined up on each side, and they're still wailing and so forth. And again, Jesus is angry. Because death has a way of claiming people he loves. He's not sad for Lazarus because he knows Lazarus is going to be back. He's not sad for Lazarus. He's probably sad for Mary and Martha and the other people, but he's angry because of what sin has done, and now death is a part of our experience, and all of that makes him upset, deeply moved in his spirit. Now, the tomb apparently looked an awful lot like the tomb that Jesus will be laid in just in a few chapters. It's a cave type thing. Sometimes, by the way, there would be a hole in the ground where people, like an underground cavern, and there'd be a hole where you'd roll the rock over so that it would be horizontal. That's the right word, right? But apparently, the way this one is described, it's a cave-type opening, and there's this giant, usually a hewn wheel-shaped stone, and it was in a groove, and you would roll it up the hill and hold it while you put the body in there, and then you'd let the rock go, and bang, it would come down and stop in front of that opening. That kept critters out, and, now you've got a secure grave. Jesus says, get that rock out of the way. Roll back the stone. Now, I'm going to remind you of something Martha said earlier. Listen. In verse 23, Martha said, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And then she says, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And you read that and you think, good for you, Martha. You believe in the resurrection of the dead. Does she? Because when Jesus says, roll back the rock, what does Martha say? Lord. He's been dead for 4 days. This is embarrassing to the family. Don't do it. Resurrection has never entered her mind at this point. I'm positive of it. All she's worried about is the embarrassment of her brother's thinking. Does anybody read from the King James? Nobody? Well, isn't that a switch from 50 years ago when I started preaching? Holy cow, I couldn't pry people out of the... But anyway, if I'm not mistaken, and Paul, I'm probably wrong about this, and I apologize to the movie watchers, I think the King James says, behold, he stinketh. That is what my memory says, but of course my memory is not worth much. But anyway, there is, she says, there's going to be an odor. Let's not take the stone back. And literally what Martha says is, this is literally from the Greek, he's a fourth day man. He's a fourth day man. That means he's been gone 4 days. This is no time to be taking back the stone. And then Jesus says, Martha, didn't I tell you that if you could believe, you could see the glory of God? Didn't I tell you that? It's interesting because back in the beginning when Jesus first got the news that Lazarus was dead, he told his disciples, you know, I'm kind of glad I wasn't there. Because this happened for the glory of God. This happened for the glory of God. When he gets there, he says to Martha, didn't I tell you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Now listen, there's a difference. He doesn't say, I'll get it right in a minute, that if you believe, I'm going to raise Lazarus. He's going to raise Lazarus regardless if anybody believes. But if you believe, what will you see? Not just a dead man coming out of the grave, you will see the glory of God. And we're going to talk about that at the end of the lesson. And what that means for us. Didn't I tell you if you believe you would see the glory of God? That's really what Jesus is interested in. Okay. Jesus spends a few moments then in audible prayer. I don't think Jesus prayed aloud very often, but he does for a specific reason. He says 2 things. Number 1, he says, first of all, I'm thankful that you heard me. It's an aorist tense, A-O-R-I-S-T, meaning some kind of action that happened in the past. And here's what I think it means. It could mean a lot of things, but here's what I think it means. When Jesus decided he was going to go back to Bethany and be this close to Jerusalem, I think he poured his heart out to God. Is this what I need to do? Is this in the right timetable? Do I dare go back there? And I am going to raise Lazarus from the dead. I believe that the preparatory prayer that Jesus prayed over here was the prayer that he's referring to when he said, I'm so glad that you heard me. And then he says, and I know that you always hear me. It's a statement of confidence. I know that you always hear me, and I'm not suggesting you don't hear me now. Really, the only reason I'm talking to you, are you paying attention, people? Is so that they will know that you and I are like this. I don't do things on my own, Jesus said. I only do what I see the Father doing. You remember him saying that? I have come to do my Father's will. I have food to eat you don't know of, and that's doing my Father's will. And so he says, when I do what I'm about to do, I want everybody to know that it's because I'm connected here. This happens because this is a reality. Okay? Everybody on board with that? So, he says that, and then, whoops, don't get too far in your notes. Oh, you almost did not. I love this next verse because it says, he says in a loud voice. And I've always felt like that was a biblical backing for my talking mouth. He said in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The said, and in the loud voice, is a word that appears only 5 other times in the New Testament. I wrote them down for you so you could look them up, so you could CF them. The first one describes how the people shouted when Jesus was riding on the donkey into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. You know where the other 5 are? They're all involving the same event. Gold star going once. When Jesus was in front of Pilate and they were screaming for him to be crucified. All 5 of the times that I listed there, they're all in that context of people yelling for his blood. So, they yelled in a loud voice. Jesus yelled in a loud voice. He didn't say, Lazarus. No, Lazarus! Come out. And you've got to know, we need to make a movie. Who will be Lazarus if we make a movie? All eyes turn. You know this. And I want you to understand something. Jesus' ministry, his life's work, is completely on the line here. If Lazarus doesn't come out of that tomb, he can't just say, gosh, I thought that would work. That's not going to be acceptable. He has made a big deal of being the resurrection and the life, and he has the power to do this, and God's going to let him, is going to empower him to do this. It's all on the line. And when they look, here he comes. Y'all remember Lon Chaney in The Mummy's Tomb? Anybody old enough to see that movie? The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb? I probably shouldn't have brought that up. It's the mental picture that I get. Because the mummy was all wrapped in cloth and he walked. Remember that? Okay. Well, I don't know how Lazarus walked. Probably a little bitter, but you know what? The Jews didn't embalm people. The Egyptians did. But the Jews didn't, but they did the next best thing. They loaded you up with spices and creams and ointments, and then they wrapped you with cloth. Now, hopefully, they didn't wrap Lazarus' legs together. We can only hope that they wrapped them separately. And then they made a special point out of making sure that his jaw was tight. They would wrap a cloth around his jaw, and then when that was done, they would put a napkin over his face so that if anybody went in there, they couldn't see him. And the Jews had, I guess it's a strange belief, I don't know what your beliefs are, but the Jews of the first century, and there's historical material to back this up, had a belief that the spirit of an individual lingered near him for 3 days. Hopeful that somehow he'd be able to get back in there and everything would be fine. But after 3 days, the spirit would give up and leave. And that's how you knew for sure that someone was dead. How long had it been?
4 days.
4 days. 4 days. And Martha might have said, Lord, not only does he stink, but the spirit's gone. You're wasting your time. Didn't I tell you, Martha, that if you believed, you'd see the glory of God? And here comes Lazarus out of the tomb. And you think there were a few jaws that were dropped at that point? Now, I'm not going to get into this now, because we're doing it next week. But you would think, wouldn't you, that everybody who saw that would be on board with Jesus, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Are they? No. Like I said, I probably shouldn't mention it because we're going to talk about that next week. But here comes a fella who has been dead for 4 days, wrapped in the grave clothes, covered in ointments and spices, and looking like Lon Chaney, who comes out of the tomb, and not everybody believes. It is really quite remarkable that that could be true. All right, I have some things. Jesus says, wouldn't someone step forward and unbind him? Would you want to do that first? Well, I mean, and the Jews had, a thing about touching a dead body because that made him unclean. I don't know how dead or alive Lazarus looks. He's still wrapped in his grave clothes. But Jesus literally has to tell someone, would someone just unwind the cloth off him, please? Because he's not dead anymore. He's alive. You need to get the cloth off it. Jesus was always looking at the practical side of things. How many people did Jesus raise during his earthly ministry? Do you know? That is recorded in the Gospels. Three. And all of them are just remarkable. One of them is a little 12-year-old girl. The apple of her daddy's eye. I don't know why she died, but Jesus took Peter, James, and John into that upper room and said to her, little girl, you can get up now. And when he brought her downstairs, and everybody went like that, he said, somebody get her something to eat. It's in the book. And the reason being, if she's been sick a long time, she's dehydrated and hasn't eaten anything. So if she's going to live now, somebody get her something to eat. Jesus always looking on the practical side. Somebody's going to have to get Lazarus out. He can't get himself out of that stuff. Somebody is going to have to unbind him. So I assume that somebody does. In John's Gospel, this is the 7th and final sign. I'm pretty sure on the final, I'm going to ask you to list the 7 signs in the Gospel of John that are designed to lead to faith. Without putting the pressure on any one individual, can you think of any other signs? I've got them here in my head, so I may not be able to remember them. What are some of the other 6 signs? Anybody want to take a shot? Yes.
Feeding 5,000.
I'm sorry?
Feeding the 5,000.
Feeding of the 5,000. Good for you.
Water into wine.
Water into wine, the very first one.
Walking on water.
Walking on water. Good for you.
Healing the blind.
Healing the blind man. And a twin to that, 3 chapters earlier, healing the lame man. 38 years. And then there's one that doesn't get a lot of press. I think it's in chapter 4. It's not positive. But it's the official son. The official son. Yeah, he's fine. Go home. He's fine. So John reports, he tells us clearly, I'm not trying to include everything. I'm just trying to put down things that will get you to believe. There are 7 signs. And of course, also, there are 7 I am statements. We'll try those next week. So brush up on your I am statements, and we'll try to get a group consensus on what the seven I am statements are of the Gospel of John. There are very few people who live a relatively long life whose lives are not disturbed by the death of someone dear to them. Nearly everybody loses a mama and a daddy. That is the way it's supposed to be. But when mamas and daddies lose their kids, That's hard. And many of you know that one of the things that I do to keep Polly in the kind of degree of wealth that she's used to is I drive people to the airport. And it is very common for a lady to say, I lost my husband 3 years ago. Or my husband died shortly after we moved to Frisco Lakes. I don't think we would have moved here if I'd have known that he was going to die. You ladies are killing us. You know that, don't you?
Shape
And-
up.
Pardon me?
Shape up.
Well,
There you go, Pat.
Paula insists that I'm going first, but look at her and look at me. You know that's not going to happen. So anyway. But most of you know this, and I don't think she'd mind me telling you that Paula's previous husband died of ALS. And she watched that horrible, slow process until he just could no longer be supported by his body. And it is a difficult thing. I posted on Facebook not long ago, and y'all won't see the significance of this, but I guess my best friend died, and he was 2.5 years younger than I was. You know, and you're not supposed to die if you're younger than me. You're a buffer between me and death if you're younger than me, you know, and he was my golf buddy and my preaching buddy and my singing buddy, and his death still haunts me. I will say to Paula, still, I miss Ken. I dreamed about Ken. I'm thinking about Ken. And so, most of us will have at least an inkling what it was like for Mary and Martha to have a close relationship with someone that they were convinced could keep people alive because he had demonstrated his healing powers on so many occasions. And now all of a sudden your brother gets sick. And Jesus isn't around. He's gone, and the brother's dead before Jesus could come, and they are absolutely devastated by that. I don't know that Mary and Martha were ever told that Jesus waited 2 days before he came. And we can say, and it's kind of what the text says, indirectly, that the reason why Jesus did that was so that people would know for absolute sure that this guy was dead. You know, and that's why he waited. But let me tell you, because I feel like I know Jesus well enough, I think he knew how much Mary and Martha were suffering during those 2 days while he didn't go. But he didn't go. And sometimes the divine timing is not what we think it ought to be.
Amen.
We know how it should be. and sometimes we tell him what it should be. And he goes, no, I'm actually working on this in a different way. I only know that Jesus seems to always be dedicated to the idea of doing things on his timetable when it's exactly the right time to do it. And maybe that's the philosophy that God himself uses, and sometimes it doesn't fit with ours, and it's difficult. I don't understand why Ken had to die. But he did. And most of you know this, his wife asked me to come and do the funeral, you know. Which I was glad to go talk about my buddy, but it was hard. It was like admitting he was dead and that we wouldn't be playing golf anymore. And here's something I want us to remember. Listen to the full sentence before you jump on me. Lazarus was not really resurrected. Lazarus was resuscitated. That doesn't mean he wasn't dead. He was still very dead. But the difference between resurrected and being resuscitated, in my opinion, is that Lazarus is going to do this again. Are you with me? I don't know how many years Lazarus has health, but I can guarantee you one thing: he died. And the little girl who was 12 years old and was given something to eat, when she was brought back to life, she died. And the other miracle of Jesus raising someone from the dead, maybe my favorite, it's in Luke 7. Jesus and his disciples see a funeral procession coming. And they're carrying the wicker basket with the body in it. And Jesus said, "Excuse me." And he speaks to the young man and he sits up in the wicker basket. That would be a funeral you could tell your wife about. But he died. Again. All I'm saying is that the resurrection that we are going to read about in the latter part of this gospel, and the resurrection that you and I are looking forward to, is a true resurrection in which we get a new one of these. Because Lazarus was still stuck with the same one he had, but it had life in it again. We are going to have new bodies, and they will never die. He who lives and believes in me will never die. Martha, you believe that? Well, I believe that you're the Son of God. Is that what you're looking for? It is difficult when someone says to you, "You know what, I think I can fix it so you'll never die. You believe that?" You can go, "Okay, you've been drinking? What?" You know, it's a magnificent claim, but it's one that we don't relate to because everybody we know eventually dies. I've told you that this 85-year-old gentleman that I've been working with, taking him to the eye doctor, buying groceries and stuff like that, said to me, and I told you this once before, he said, "I figured out that I'm not going to get out of this world alive." And I thought, yeah, you got it figured out right. And neither am I. A couple more things. Oh, we're doing good, Paul. As we face death, is this whole thing about dying? Well, kind of. As we face death, we testify about what we believe most deeply. I'm not suggesting that you have to be a Pollyanna, because I think there is some trepidation which is allowed, but it's also in the face of death that we literally, most clearly demonstrate our faith and what we believe about death and the power of Jesus. Do you know that? I mean that's when our faith comes in the most important. Do you remember back here in chapter 5? Some of you say, chapter 5, I didn't think we were going to get to 11. Jesus says, "A time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out." There's a day coming when everybody's going to hear his voice and come out. That's why he said, "Lazarus, come forth." Not, "Hey, everybody." No, just Lazarus. But there's a day coming. I don't know if he'll call us by name. Can you hear that? Phyllis? John? And 44 million people come out, John? It's a fairly common name. But that's the day that we're looking for. Jesus said, "You think that's amazing? Let me tell you. There's coming a day when all who are in the tombs will hear my voice. And they'll come out." Not just Lazarus. Lazarus is a foretaste of things to come for every single one of us. So, I have had occasion to talk with people in the medical field. Don't say that, Dawn. I have nurse friends. That's what I'm trying to say. I have nurse friends who have talked to me in some detail about what it's like ministering to different people whose lives are shortly to end. And the different attitudes, the different ways that people approach death, face death. And I'd like to tell you that it's all in connection with their Christian faith, but it probably isn't. But they have told me that some people are so nasty and surly when they get close to death. And I think, well, you know. And some people are so nice and face death with such confidence. I brought this book, so notice, Debbie, it has the turkey bookmarker in it. Debbie said I was a turkey and gave me a bookmark. This is by B-U-R-G-E, Burge, who knows. He says, when I was in seminary, I had my first internship at a Lutheran church, where I was asked to lead a group of high school students. It was a wonderful experience in which I was mentored for the first time by a pastor and by experienced lay leaders. The layperson working closest to me was a woman named Barbara. She was a model of conviction and hope, whose heart was devoted to the church and its ministries. For 6 months, I valued every moment in which she provided advice and inspiration to continue in the ministry. And then one day, Barbara gave me a phone call I will never forget. She said she had a brain tumor and explained the gradual deterioration of her otherwise athletic physique. Most remarkable of all, the tumor was inoperable, and I watched as Barbara wasted away. 2 months later, just before she died, I remember Barbara taking my hand and talking with me in confidence about her faith. She knew this was hard for me, and her last words to me were these: "Don't worry about me. I'm about to go on the greatest adventure of my life." And soon after, she died. Paul writes, if it's only in this life that we have hope, we are of all people most to be pitied. I'm not one who just has to emphasize all the time, pie in the sky, by and by, but I will tell you what, the older I get, the more I realize how important it is to look at death, knowing that you're holding the hand of the one who is the resurrection and the life. And I hope that you will remember that too. I have 2 quick points to make at the end, and then I'll quit. And I don't even think these are in your notes. But I said that, I know what Jesus said to Lazarus. I know what Jesus said to Martha. And I know what Jesus says to Mary. But what is Jesus saying to us? In this story, I think we hear Jesus saying, we must always see the sin behind the situation and grieve. Maybe more than that. And be indignant. Maybe even more than that. Be angry. It's not really irreconcilable differences that lead to divorce. It is sin. And as a divorcee, I can tell you, that's it. Oh, but you don't know what my sin... Listen. Sin is at the root of all of that. And I don't believe the church is split over various views of Scripture. I believe the church is split because of sin. And we have to see it. And it should make us angry that God intended the community of the people of Jesus to be in love with one another, and we see that fellowship ruptured. It ought to make us mad. Not at the people, but at the sin that causes it. And in light of what we watch on the news, nations don't go to war over natural resources. They go because of sin. Evil. And we are people who understand that that there's a terrible scar on our world that sin has made, and it ought to make us angry. Jesus says, behind the situation, be indignant about the sin. And number 2, may you always see the glory in the answer to the prayers that you have and believe. Take back the stone. Oh, Lord, no, no. He's a 4-day man. Martha, Martha, didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Did everybody see the glory of God that day? No. Some turned right around and went and told on him. That's next week. Literally. They went and said, you wouldn't believe what happened. But for those who were believers, they saw the glory of God. And I am firmly convinced that God is alive and well, and He works in our world. And I wished I could tell you why some of your prayers go unanswered and some of them are answered, but I know I have enough experience on both of those. But when we see the answer, we have to see the glory of God. God is amazing, and He does amazing things. And unfortunately, sometimes our belief is so shallow that we don't see the glory. So be angry at the sin behind the situation, but see the glory of God in the answers to your prayers. That's what I think that the Lord is saying to us in this part of John chapter 11. Okay, that's all I got on that. I want to repeat. Did you turn it off, Paul?
I'm trying.